back as far as the historical records go was Ponce de Leon, who came and was looking for the Fountain of Youth and did sail up the coast. And in addition to his landing in St. Augustine, which almost everybody knows about, he did sail the coast, and he did stop twice in what is now Palm Beach County at two Indian villages. And one was called Tequesta, and the other one was called Abacoa, interestingly enough. And we really don't know where they were from his logs, but we are in a part of Florida that pushes furthest east into the Gulf Stream. And so they were very much navigationally aware of that geographical form, so we can identify Palm Beach County basically by that bulge in the map that pushes furthest east. And so at that time, the tribe here was known as the Yega or the Jaga. They were pre-Columbian Indians, again very sparse, maybe 2,000 people in the tribe, and they mostly hunted and ate shellfish and lived off the land and ate palmetto berries and such. They had very little agriculture. There's some evidence they might have grown a little corn from time to time, but they were mostly hunter-gatherers rather than farmers. And when the Spanish came, of course, they brought two things that decimated the local population, which was disease and slave trade. So they took many of these slaves and many of the Native Americans and captured them, sent them to North Carolina and South Carolina to plantations, to work on the plantations. Some were sent to the Caribbean to work in the sugar fields. And between that and disease, by about 1720, the indigenous population had pretty much disappeared. At that time, Florida was still a possession of Spain. Even after the American Revolution, Florida remained part of Spain. And so it became a refuge for runaways, first of all, runaway slaves, and also runaway Indians from the Trail of Tears when the Indians were being shipped to Oklahoma. So the Seminoles were not really an indigenous tribe. They were the amalgamation of these runaways, and the name Seminole is derived from a Spanish word that means runaway. And they were the ones who basically lived here between the early 1700s and when the U.S. acquired Florida from Spain in about 1819, 1820. And part of the impetus was to eliminate this refuge for runaways. And it was, unfortunately, Andrew Jackson, who later became president, who was the big champion of clearing the land of the natives, who organized the first Seminole War, actually before the land was acquired from Spain, about 1817 to 1819. And then there was a second Seminole War in the 1830s and 40s. There's a big battlefield on the Loxahatchee River, which is the remnant of the Second Seminole War. And then there was a smaller Third Seminole War in the 1850s. And after that, the land was pretty much cleared out of indigenous peoples. Everybody that they could catch was shipped off to Oklahoma. And there was a small band of Seminoles that were able to hide in Big Cypress and other places deep in the Everglades and maintain their culture. But their estimates are that there were between 200 and 400 that survived. This land was totally empty at that point in time. When the crews were going out building roads, they came across an Indian mound in what is approximately 12th Avenue to 14th Avenue South between L Street and K Street, and included bones. It wasn't a midden, in other words, it wasn't just remains of shells and a refuge dump, but apparently was a ceremonial site and had bones in it and so forth. The surveying crew sent the bones to the Smithsonian, and who verified that they were pre-Columbian bones. We have information on this both from the Lake Worth Herald, from the discovery of the bones, and confirmed from the archives of the Smithsonian that they received the bones. The bones were dated to before Columbus, and they were sent back to Lake Worth, presumably with the idea of putting them on display someplace, but they disappeared, and we don't know what happened to them. Now the county does have a county archaeologist, and I've spoken to Chris Davenport about that. That land that was this Indian mound was buried, and that all the dirt was used for to fill in the swamp area. But he's of the opinion that there's definitely stuff underground if the exact area of the mound could be located. So it's there are houses currently on that area, but there are several rights of way, the 13th Avenue South, for example, that cuts across that, where it would be very possible to do an archaeological dig. The Jupiter Light was the first major building in this area, built in 1860, just before the Civil War. And there was a house there for the lighthouse keeper, and then a guest house. And it was really the center along this coast. So the Pierce family was out adventuring, and they sailed down one winter and stayed at the Jupiter Light. And it was pointed out to them that here was this beautiful Lake Worth to the south, 44-mile circumference, freshwater lake at that time, and a beautiful growing place for farming. It was known on some Spanish maps as El Jardín, in other words, the garden. That's where Palm Beach Gardens gets its name from these old Spanish maps. And so Captain Armour, who was the lighthouse keeper, told the Pierces, there's nobody living down here on this entire lake, why don't you settle down there? So in the mid-1870s, there was absolutely nobody in this area that we know of. And the Pierces moved down, chose a homestead on Manalapan Island because it was freer of bugs with the breeze off the ocean and a little bit of protection from the wind off the beach, being a little bit inland. In 1999, there was a series of articles in the Palm Beach Post by Scott McCabe where he knew about a couple by the name of Fanny and Samuel James that had moved to this area in the 1880s as the very first settlers in what was a very harsh environment. They were, of course, living at the time of the end of the Civil War in Tallahassee, which had been a heart of reconstruction from the end of the Civil War. The federal troops left in 1877, and the black population, office holders and voters, started to be intimidated by the Klan and others at that time as white supremacy started to reemerge. And there was a movement among the black intellectuals at that time saying, go homestead, own your own land, don't be a sharecropper, don't hang around here and make yourself a victim of this reemerging segregation. So probably part of their motive in coming down here was to own their own land and be a free people who could support themselves, grow their own food, and do their own business without the climate that existed in northern and central Florida at that time. Even though most of the country was settled by the 1880s, the state of Washington, California, Colorado were all settled, South Florida was almost empty. This was really everglades at that time before the canals were dredged. There was a lot of flooding and very wet land, and the mosquitoes were atrocious. There used to be jokes about 90 mosquitoes per cubic inch, and it was very hot and sticky. We do know that Fanny was born in North Carolina and Samuel in Virginia. And we know that Fanny's family migrated during the Civil War from North Carolina to Ohio, across the battle lines of the Civil War at that time, across the Ohio River into a free state where they didn't have to worry about being captured and thrown into slavery. Many blacks, even if they were free at that time, were just kidnapped and enslaved during the war. So we don't know whether she was a slave or her family before her had been slaves, but they were in a heavy tobacco growing area in North Carolina, and during the war they migrated, and we have the records of the family and her cousins and everything. And this particular town in Ohio was known as an abolitionist stronghold. They had the first schools for black children in the 1850s before the Civil War. And so it's very possible that Fanny got her education. She could definitely read. Samuel couldn't, by the way. He often signed his name with an X or whatever. But Fanny was the business person in the family. But he had good business savvy too, because he was a carpenter and he did a lot of work, for the neighbors, and was very enterprising as well. So exactly where they got some of these skills, we don't know. They moved down here from Tallahassee and got this, the first homestead was on the tract of land which is now from the Lake Worth Bridge down to 12th Avenue South. They had a mile of water frontage. that went west to about M Street, and it amounted to about 187 acres. A lot of people saw the potential, so a lot of the homesteading was on speculation. They just wanted to get title to the land. Many times they would comply with the requirements of the law to build a house and plant an orchard or something, and then would go back up north for the summer, so they didn't have to put up with it, and the oranges would grow, and then they'd come back for harvest, whatever. A lot of people didn't stay. And the thing that was unique about the Jameses is that they came and they stayed through the year, and they were a permanent part. So they were the social hub of the community. And as soon as they got title to the land, they used something called preemption, which means they had to pay like $2.25 an acre or something. So they paid their $400 or whatever, and they got title to the land very quickly, and then began to subdivide it in typical Florida fashion and to sell it off to land speculators. There was already established a community in Palm Beach of fairly affluent people who would winter down there. And so a lot of the land along here was subdivided in 10 and 20 acre parcels, were sold on spec to investors in Palm Beach. But there were a few people that did move in to stay, and that did live here and farm here. And we have records of this, of course, from the homestead applications, where you see what they did, with the land and so forth. So the Jameses acquired first this 187 acres, subdivided it, sold it off. In the Palm Beach County archival records, we were able to find all the bills of sale. We know exactly how much they sold the money for. So they invested about $400 and made about $6,000 in 1890s money, pretty good money. And then they turned around and took out a second homestead that went along what is now a Lake Avenue, down to 6th Avenue South, all the way west to F Street. So they had another 160 acres. And they did the same thing there. They subdivided it and sold off parts of it. The Bureau of Land Management has digitized all the old homestead applications. And so we were able to get digitized copies of the original applications in the handwriting and language of the homesteaders, who were able to take out a 160 acre section. If they built a home on it and cleared some land for some agriculture, they could get title to it. After 5 or 7 years, the law changed at various points. When in the 1885 census, Florida did a census in between the US census, the population of South Florida, which now includes Martin County, Palm Beach County, Broward, and Miami-Dade, the entire population of that quarter of South Florida was 333 people. Approximately 100 people lived in Palm Beach. Approximately 150 people lived down in Biscayne Bay, what was called Lemon City at that time, in Miami, with the remainder scattered about in the area in between. And so you can just imagine 333 people filling up this whole area. The mail delivery was by boat because there were no roads, the land was too soggy. The only way to get around was by boat on the water. So the first post office was right on the water in what is now South Bryant Park, between 4th and 5th Avenue South, and on the Intercoastal in Lake Worth. And that was the site of the post office, which they ran out of their home. And that was on the parcel, of course, that was part of their first homestead. We're having fun out here in Bryant Park today, trying to find the site of the original James homestead and the first Jewell post office. So there's certain things we know with precision exactly what the numbers were, and there's certain things that we're making reasonable guesstimates at. We know exactly where the James property was. It was 158 feet wide, starting at the wall where the birthday cake castle is now coming north. And we know that it was approximately 300 feet deep, but on this side of what is now Lakeside Drive. So we've positioned the house in the middle of that property, about 75 feet off of the wall, about 50 feet off of the water, and that's the enclosure you see here. The closest sidewalk is where we figured that the waterfront probably was before the seawall was built, and that was filled in. That goes to a little bit further east now. The Jameses would have lived here and gotten the mail delivery by boat
between 1889, when the post office was opened, and 1896, when the railroad went in. Once the railroad was in, the mail was dropped off by the railroad instead of by boat, and they moved further west toward L Street, where their second homestead was. But they still did entertain guests, and we think continued to use this house even after they moved into a larger house to the west. So it's quite exciting to think about this is where the Jameses would have lived and set up their post office in 1889. And so when you come here to this place, think about the deep historic significance of this location, that it was the very beginning of the city of Lake Worth, and that brave pioneers ventured the swamps and the mosquitoes and the isolation in order to establish what was to become our beloved little city.
What we have is Fanny's application for the post office, in which she writes first the name La Paz, which means in Spanish peace. And so they were escaping this hostile environment up north, and they were thinking about naming it La Paz. And there's actually some stationery and some other documentation that seems to indicate that the name was in currency for at least a short period of time in calling it La Paz. So that apparently was one of their motives in coming down here, was to escape the Jim Crow and the white backlash after Reconstruction. And then interestingly enough, she wrote Deer Park, and there were a lot of native deer in this area, and we know it was an Indian hunting ground and so forth, so there were a lot of wild deer in the area. That was also crossed off, and then Jewell was written in. And Jewell became the official name of the post office when the application was approved in 1889. The Jameses had been here 4 years before the post office was open. But we really don't know where it came from. No search has shown anybody named Jewell, spelled with 2 L's. It looks like a last name. And so you think it may have been named after somebody, but we don't know that for sure. It might also have been a description of the place as the Jewell. Of course, we're near the Treasure Coast, where a lot of the Spanish galleons had wrecked, and they were regularly finding treasure, including emeralds and other gemstones on the beach. So it's possible there's some tie in there. We really don't know where the name Jewell comes from. When Flagler built the railroad, it came to West Palm Beach in 1894, and then to Miami in 1896. It was completed. So it went through this area and was open for operation in 1896. So the mail delivery then was by train. And so the Jameses then, on their second homestead, which was out west, built another home near the railroad tracks and ran the post office out of that location, which is somewhere between South K Street and South L Street now, and right by the FEC track, which of course is still the original railroad track that came through the area. So that was their second homestead. And then they were so well known for their hospitality. We have records from local papers at that time that were almost like gossip columns. So-and-so came to visit on Sunday afternoon, and we had a great time, we had a square dance or whatever. And there were several reports of people stopping by Jewell. There was a wharf where they could tie up their boat. Samuel was a carpenter, and so he did help build his house and neighbors' houses and various wharfs in the area. And so Jewell had a little wharf. It was known as the best stopping place on the lake between Boynton Beach and West Palm Beach. The U.S. Census tells us about their neighbors. I mentioned they were living in a household with an African-American family. On the other side, next door to them, was a man who was the postmaster of Tallahassee during Reconstruction. He was an African-American man. And he served in the Florida legislature for a term, and he was a commissioner of Gadsden County and other things. And so probably Fanny got the skills about how to run a post office from her neighbor next door. So it was one place that she might have gotten some of her skills. The nearest neighbor to the north was Ben Landhart, a bachelor, who built a little palmetto shack in what was to become West Palm Beach, and he was their nearest neighbor to the north, 6 miles north the other way. When they signed the application to put in the post office, one of the questions that was asked is, how many people will this post office serve? And the number that they put down was 13. And the 13 included the 2 of them. So there were 11 other people who were using this post office, so we can see how sparsely populated this area was, how inhospitable it was. The beginnings of the city of Lake Worth itself were by Palm Beach Farms Company. Interestingly enough, they were a Colorado corporation because they'd been involved in developing towns out west, but this was kind of the last frontier, South Florida and the Everglades and so forth. And so they came up with the idea of forming the Palm Beach Farms Company and doing development down here. They originally had a land site in Delray, had an experimental farm, and were trying to build a town down there. But the prices went up when people knew that they were after the land. So they moved their plans north and secretively began to buy out the homesteaders who were here starting about 1910. The developer came up with the name Lucerne, and apparently they wanted to name it after some place in the Swiss Alps, which seems totally ludicrous. Here in South Florida, flat, tropical, no mountains, you know, why would you name it Lucerne? They applied to the post office, but there was another Lucerne, town of Lucerne in Florida, and so that application was refused, and eventually they came up with the name Lake Worth. General Worth was a general during the Second Seminole War, and he was quite ruthless, as a matter of fact, and he brought in Chief Osceola under a flag of truce and then executed him and so forth. So he wasn't even an honorable man within the norms of warfare at that time. But when the Seminoles were cleared out of the area, the federal government and the normal procedure with homesteading was to survey the lots so that you could give away 160-acre lots. So they had surveyors come in and do the mapping and subdivide the land. And Lake Worth was named in that process probably around 1858. 1859 is when that surveying was taking place. The lake originally, the Aboriginal name, was some derivative of Hypoluxo, which apparently means surrounded by water, can't get out, because it was so close to the ocean, but yet landlocked. And it was a Seminole word. And so the name Lake Worth itself didn't come into being until after the Indians, the Native Americans, had been cleared out of the area. Lake Worth became salty first in the 1860s. There was a Confederate deserter by the name of August Lang who lived down here during the Civil War. And the story is that he lived in what became Palm Beach, and that there were heavy rains, and that the level of Lake Worth came up to the top of the dune in Palm Beach. And this was freshwater lake at that time because there were no inlets to come back, so it was all drainage from the Everglades. And the story is that he took a stick and made a little trench from the top of the dune down to the ocean, and that the water started to run, you know, through that trench and actually opened up the first inlet and in Palm Beach. And that at that time, the saltwater intrusion at the high tide, the water would run in from the ocean, killed all the freshwater fish off. The reports are that it stunk for 2 weeks from all the dead fish and so forth, the freshwater fish that were here at that time. This was a very mobile opening. It kept drifting further south. There are reports of people trying to get their boats into Lake Worth, having various adventures, running aground, having to get out and push the boat back into the channel. Sometimes there are stories of sharks circling around while they're in the water, trying to get their boat off the sand and so forth. So, and that continued to move at various, and open and close at various times. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually came in the early 1900s and built a permanent inlet where the current Palm Beach Inlet is now. What the Palm Beach Farms Company did is they bought not only this land here that was to become the city, but also land to the west that was later to become Green Acres. And they coupled lots in town with agricultural land to the west on the same deed. And people would buy these contracts that did not, that gave them the rights to a drawing that eventually they would get a parcel of land in the city to build a house on and agricultural land to the west, but they didn't know specifically what it was. Some of this land was still underwater with promises that the canals were being built and shortly it would be usable. We have to remember that this was the day of the beginning of the automobile. And so people, instead of living on their farmstead, could live in town, have all the amenities of living in town, and yet have a farm out west. And so especially if they were growing pineapples or they were growing oranges, there was no need to be on the farm daily. And so there was no need to live scattered away. The other thing that the developer did to attract people to come to town was to create a lot of amenities to make people want to live here. And so almost from the beginning, they built a beach house over on the beach and operated a ferry before the bridge so people could go and have outings at the sea. They built a band shell and had a town band and had regular concerts in town. They built a dance hall and they had regular events there. They built the horseshoe pits and they had regular competitions, and we have photographs of all these amenities being built. So they did a lot to draw people to the town and create a vibrant life in the community that would attract people to buy land here and move here. For about 2 years they acquired property and that eventually became the town of Lake Worth. And they bought out Fanny James's remaining holdings. The parts that she hadn't sold off amounted to about 150 acres at that time from various parcels that she had saved here and there of their holdings. And she was paid fair money. At that time, it was about $2,000 for on a 2-year basis on mortgage. And that mortgage was settled and it was paid. But we're talking about different times now. By 1910, the population had grown, the segregation laws were started to be applied, the Jim Crow laws, to this area. And so the original charter of the city of Lake Worth called for segregated housing districts. It called for white residential districts in which only white people would live, and colored, as they called it at that time, residential districts in which only the colored would live. The thing was that they never established any colored residential districts. And so that the town was an all-white community from its inception in 1913 for about 13 years until 1926. So Fanny, when she sold her property, had to move out of town. At that time, the city limits were 12th Avenue South. And so, they did have some holdings that they bought from another European family, a Swede by the name of Oleg Gudmundsson. And she moved apparently into his home, which was just across the line, 12th Avenue South and now Dixie Highway. That would have been her third homestead. And she had about 1.25 acres. She was an elderly person by that time, in her early 70s, but she still had 41 chickens. She still drove her horse and buggy. And Dixie Highway at that time was called the County Road. It was a gravel road. And she had her lawyer who dealt with her real estate transactions and others up in West Palm Beach. And she would drive her horse and buggy as a 70-year-old woman to West Palm to do her business. And unfortunately what happened, she was killed in an automobile accident on that road in 1915. She was on her way to West Palm Beach in a morning in June. There was one of the early automobiles coming southbound on the highway. She apparently stopped to talk to a neighbor who was driving a lumber truck, and somehow she was hit by this car on a gravel road in 1915, if you can imagine. And the best we can surmise, the best story of how this might have happened, is if she had stopped her horse and buggy on one side of the road and then crossed the road to talk to the neighbor, her horse might have been spooked by the sound of this car coming down the road, and she might have run across the road in an attempt to calm her horse and maybe was struck, perhaps, in that process. She was taken to the colored hospital in West Palm at that time. Surgery was performed. We have in the probate records all the bills and her doctor's names and all these other details of what happened, but they were unable to save her life, and she did pass, as a result of that accident. But the obituaries that were published in the paper at that time just spoke so highly of her as a well-beloved person and a founder of the community, the hub of the social life, and so forth. And so we have, these records that show what their reputation was at that time, despite the fact that they were living in a Jim Crow era and were talking about a mixed race woman. One of the early editions of the Palm Beach Post from 1906, I believe, that lists all the major growers of pineapples in the area. And Fanny James is the only woman and the only person of color on that list. So she was very well liked, very well respected, and she always invested her money well. She loaned money to the Bank of Lake Worth. She loaned money to the Palm Beach Fair Association. A group of prominent people in West Palm and Palm Beach got together and created the county fair. And she actually loaned $2,000 to them on interest, on 8% interest. And so not only was she well liked, but she was really involved, in the higher finance and with the well-known prominent people in the area. Totally amazing for an African-American woman. And a lot of people ask the question of how in the 1880s, with the segregation laws becoming, after the Civil War, becoming de jure, part of the law of the state, how did this African-American couple manage to get this prominence and this acceptance in a predominantly white community? And I think the answer to that is that South Florida was a very different place than North or Central Florida at that time. There were a lot of immigrants here from around the world. There were a lot of Bahamians. The population was very sparse, so that anybody who was willing to work and contribute to the growth of the community was respected and accepted. Charles Pierce, who lived on what's now Manalapan Island. The Pierces were here in the 1870s, married a Bahamian woman. So the culture here was very different than it was in the rest of the state. And the Jameses were accepted along with everybody else. And so it's really interesting in view of Lake Worth's current diversity, because we have a lot of Caribbean people here, we have a lot of Haitian people here, we have a lot big Latino community here. Lake Worth prides itself on its diversity. When we go back in our early history, we find that diversity in our roots. We found that when Fanny died, that there was probate, and her probate case is a 200-page document. Fanny did have some luxuries in her old age. From the probate records, we know that she had carpeting, she had upholstered furniture, she had a Victrola, she had an icebox, and so forth. So, she did have some amenities there at that time, but we don't have any physical description of them other than the fact that they were mulatto. But we do have some description of her cousins. As I mentioned, the family moved to Ohio. Several of her older cousins joined the Union Army in the colored troops, and there we have detailed descriptions of their height. They were definitely light-skinned, called yellow complected. One of them even had blue eyes, but apparently was dark enough to be considered colored, in the context of the time. So the odds are that they were clearly of mixed race, tend to be lighter skinned, but also at the same time clearly with African American heritage. The estate was valued at $12,000 in 1915 dollars, which would be about $250,000 today. The report says that Samuel came to Palm Beach County with $50 in his pocket to work as a carpenter in Palm Beach. So they parlayed that $50 into $12,000 over the period of time, about 30 years that they were here. Samuel was buried by their second homestead, and she refused to sell the burial site to them. So on the original plat, there's a 10 by 10 reservation marked with great detail by the survey where Samuel was buried, which happens to be on the 300 block of South L Street now. And that's still currently on the records. And if you get a survey of that property, you'll still see this 10 by 10 reservation. We know exactly where that was because of this description of it being so many feet north of this property line and so many feet south of this property line. And because it was put in before the roads were put in, it was just basically a spot in the woods. It's tilted a little bit to the northwest. And even those details of the exact measurement in feet with decimal points is included in that original survey. So we know exactly where Samuel was buried. There were investigations done by the city of Lake Worth with ground penetrating radar to see if they could find any remnants of that, and they came up with sort of neutral results. They said there was a disturbance of the soil that was consistent with a burial, but no remains of a coffin or bones or anything like that that they could detect. And so the odds are that at some point he was exhumed. There was a wrought iron fence and a tombstone. Of course, Fanny had some money, and so she did make a very nice burial plot for her husband. At some point in the 20s, oral history, we have this from the neighbors, men came in the middle of the night, dug up the fence and the gravestone and threw them in the intercoastal. It's very possible that Samuel was exhumed at that same time. People were kind of spooked by the idea of having a graveyard in their backyard. And so it's very possible that he was dug up and nobody knows what happened to his remains. Whereas Fanny is buried, we have mixed reports on that. The Lake Worth Herald reported that she was due to be buried beside her husband on South L Street. Lillian Voss Pierce, who was a relative of the Pierce's, diary came out, who said that Fanny was buried nearby. And it makes sense that she was buried outside the city limits because of the Jim Crow of the age, probably behind her third house down on South 12th Avenue South. But we don't really know where she was buried except for those two reports that are contradictory. What happened then, after this area became better settled and the Jim Crow laws became enacted in this area, was that Lake Worth was an all-white community. And even though they had to have separate but equal to pass constitutional muster at that time, the city charter calls for black residential districts and white residential districts in which the other could not live. By the way, the penalty for living in the wrong area of the wrong race at that time was a $500 fine for each 10 days of residence. And again, $1915. You can imagine what this was. But the city fathers did not designate any black residential districts. And the city limits at that time were 12th Avenue South. So there was an area between Lantana and Lake Worth that was sort of a no man's land, and that's where the black community lived. And there were quarters there that were for the workers of the farms, Bahamians and other African Americans first settled in that area. They were not part of the city of Lake Worth. Neither Lake Worth nor Lantana wanted that population. In 1926, Lantana was expanding, and they annexed the area right up to where the current city limit is, which is about halfway between Lantana Road and 6th Avenue South. And Lake Worth, not to be outdone, annexed all the land south to that line, all the way west to Military Trail, interestingly enough. And then they had that black population in the city for the first time. And the Ku Klux Klan was operating very openly at that time. They even ran a school here in a two-story building someplace downtown, which they bragged about in a newspaper called the Fiery Cross, which was published in Indianapolis. It was a national Klan publication. And they were quite proud of the fact that they had this all-white school in Lake Worth. Looking back at the city records, there was a move to expand the colored district at that time, which included that land down to Barton Road further to the west. And so then several women went to the city council and said, well, now we have these blacks living in our area, you have to drive them out, this is an all-white town. The city fathers, in their wisdom, instead of doing that, did designate the first black residential district to be that area that became the historic black community between 12th Avenue South and the city limits of Lantana. That area was definitely enclosed. It was very much like a ghetto, if you will. There was a wall built along the northern part of that, running from 12th Avenue South, partway down toward Lantana. Then there was a city dump that was enclosing the rest of it down to the city limits. And I've heard story tell that people woke up one morning and there was just trash being dumped there. And people decided they didn't want that large of a black community, and they just created the dump ad hoc in order to limit the growth of that community. So this addition was in 1949, according to the city clerk's records. And so it's probably sometime shortly thereafter that the dump was founded. There were no through streets to Lantana. It was a commercial industrial area, and it's a solid wall there to the south. So that enclosed that ghetto area to the south. And then there was the FEC tracks that ran kind of forming a triangle that was called the Osborne Colored Addition, which was the traditional black neighborhood, which continued to exist as an all-black neighborhood until federal law overturned it with the Fair Housing Act in the 60s. So that was the area where the black community lived until they were allowed to intermix. They were in the city of Lake Worth. The police did patrol the area. If you talk to older people, they'll tell about having been stopped by the police and asked, questions, especially if they were outside of the area at night. They were very often expected to have a note from an employer or some other excuse, or to be in their area after dark. They got very few city services. Most of the roads down there were unpaved and sandy and so forth, and no street lighting and no sewer and so forth and so on. But they were part of the city, and as far as we know, there were, if there were crimes committed down there, that the city of Lake Worth police did take part. And eventually there were some African Americans on the police force that helped to ease relations with that community and so forth into the 50s and early 60s. There was down in that community a boarding house for blacks, and there was a school, the all-black school, which is currently called the Osborne School. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, still standing. It was a 3-room schoolhouse. There were stores and other facilities. In the wake of these articles in the Palm Beach Post in 1999, the mayor of Lake Worth at that time was Tom Remigio, and he was very much interested in the history, and he was instrumental in erecting and dedicating that little monument in front of the current post office on J Street in Lucerne. It turns out that the term Black Diamonds was quite popular for minstrel groups at that time. There was a band that played in Lantana at one point and in Miami, and there were notices in the paper about the Black Diamonds. So it's very possible there was a little play on words or some mixing of that popular name with the Jameses. But they were also respected, and so them being called Diamonds, fits in with their reputation in the community. The general knowledge of history always enlightens us about the human condition. Those that don't know their history are destined to repeat it. And sometimes people have attitudes that we don't understand where they're coming from. And when we know their personal history and their struggles, it helps us to understand each other. So this is really the universal question about why history is important. On a local level, we are living in a community where people are mostly from other places. Don't know much about this local history and don't really have roots in this local community. So them knowing about what happened before with the indigenous people, whether it's the Jaga or the Seminoles or the early settlers here or the early establishment of the town, and all these things that happen in between, really helps people feel connected and builds community here locally.